Good morning. This is Shamika Spencer with the National Association of State Energy Officials, and I want to welcome everyone to the NASEO EIA 2017-2018 Winter Energy Outlook webinar. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. First, we will be recording today's webinar, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email to all participants with the link to the recording and presentations once it has been uploaded to the NASEO website. Second, you have joined today's webinar listening through your computer speaker system by default. This means if you can hear music through your computer, you will be able to hear the presentation. If you would like to call in using the phone, just locate your audio pane and select Use Telephone. The dial-in information, access code, and audio pin will then be displayed. Finally, to avoid background noises during the webinar, everyone has been placed on mute. At the end of each of today's presentations, we will do several minutes of Q&A. I encourage you to enter your questions and comments in the question or chat panes on the control panel. Also, you can use the hand raise icon on the control panel to indicate that you wish to be unmuted so that you may ask your question directly to the panelists. Please note that if you're listening through your computer speakers, you must have microphone capabilities on your computer in order to ask questions directly. For those who are listening via telephone, you must enter in the audio pin provided with the dial-in information in order to enable you to do this. Now I'm going to introduce David Terry, NASEO's Executive Director, who will provide the welcome and introductions. David?
Thank you, Shamika, and welcome everybody to the NASEO EIA Winter Energy Outlook webinar. As Shamika noted, we have a number of great presentations today. We've been doing this joint meeting or webinar with the Energy Information Administration for over 20 years. The state energy offices across the country, our members, and the many governors and legislators and participants, partners in the states that they work with find the information presented each year invaluable, both from the private sector, some of our presenters will hear from, as well as, of course, our colleagues at the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which we've had a long-standing and excellent partnership with for many years. I want to thank in particular John Conti and Shirley Neff at EIA for their help in bringing today's webinar together, as well as Shamika Spencer in coordinating our speakers and agenda. In order to make the most of our time, I'm going to keep my remarks short. A couple of quick reminders. As Shamika noted, at the end of each presentation, you have the opportunity to ask questions either by typing it in or through raising your hand. Also, I'm just going to give a brief introduction of each of the presenters now. We will be posting their full bios online along with the presentations at the conclusion of the webinar. So with that, let's get started. We have today with us Mike Halpert, the Deputy Director of the Climate Prediction Center at the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration. Mike is a long-standing presenter and expert that has provided an exceptional outlook to our weather. It helps folks plan and forecast energy supply, prices, demand. This is important not only in terms of winter heating issues, although that is a principal piece of the outlook, but many other aspects of energy. And it helps inform state policy, the private sector, any liquid fuels users, certainly electricity and other markets. So we'll hear from Mike, his forecast shortly. Then we'll hear from Eric Lee, a senior energy analyst with Citi Commodities Research. Citibank, Citi has been also a longstanding partner in this meeting, providing their expertise. Then we'll hear from John Conti, the acting administrator of the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and Tim Hess, also with EIA, to provide their forecast and outlook. With that, I will begin by turning it over to Mike to hear a little bit about our weather forecast. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, David. Hopefully folks can see my screen and can hear me okay. I guess in past years we've all gathered for this, and so we're going to try it a little different way this year and do it remotely, although I do a lot of my presentations remotely, so shouldn't be a real challenge for me. I will use the outline that I've typically used, so we'll talk a little bit about what a seasonal outlook is and also what it isn't. We'll look back at last year's outlook, what we expected to happen, and we'll look to see what actually did happen. So kind of a real-time, what we call verification or a ground truth as to what actually occurred. Then probably what folks are more interested in, we'll look ahead to what could impact the climate during the upcoming winter. I will then give the outlook, and if I've got a few minutes left, I wanted to highlight some new products that we've started issuing a year or two ago that might be of interest to some in this community. Our subseasonal outlooks really focused on what we call week 3 and week 4. So we issue our seasonal outlooks in terms of temperature and precipitation. For temperature, we look at the mean temperature over the 90-day period, roughly 90-day period. For precipitation, we look at the accumulated or the total amount. These are done in terms of specific categories. We've broken these into terciles, so there's basically 3 possible outcomes. You can either be below average, near average, or above average. And those cutoff points are basically looked at historical data, roughly a 30-year period. In this case, we've looked at the period from 1981 to 2010 and come up with to be in the upper tercile, you need to be in the top 10, middle tercile, and then the lower tercile. These forecasts are maybe a little unique in terms of we have the ability, if there's really no clear indication of what we'll see, to call an area equal chances. And so in a 3-class system, it means there's basically a 1/3 chance that any of the 3 outcomes will occur. And it's also very important to understand that when we look at the maps, and we'll look at an example here in a minute, that there'll be colors that are showing what we call the dominant category or the favored category. But when you're dealing with probabilities, there is still always some chance, although a less likely chance, that one of the other 2 categories will occur. So here is an example back from I guess 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago now, in 2011. Temperature map on the left, precipitation on the right. If we just look at the temperature map, since for energy concerns, that's probably the more relevant map. You'll see areas where we have blue shades and we have red shades. As one would expect, I guess the blue shaded areas are favored, or the dominant category is below average. The orange and reds would be favored to be above average. But you'll see, if you look up in this particular example in the state of Washington, where it has kind of the darker shade of blue, that's judged to be about a 45% chance for that season that temperatures would be in that lowest tercile, or the lowest 1/3 of the distribution. But you'll notice there still is, fairly decent probability, roughly that same 1/3 of near average, and there still is even a chance temperatures would be above average. And really that's what we can say in terms of seasonal outlooks. It's not like the forecast for tomorrow that people can give you a pretty more definite, high around 75 degrees tomorrow. Really, what you can say on a seasonal time scale is much less. There's much less confidence, and that confidence is really reflected in the probabilistic nature of the outlook. So again, these seasonal outlooks are done once per month. So we say around the middle of the month. It's basically released on the 3rd Thursday of every month. It turns out that the outlooks that I will be showing you today for the upcoming winter will be updated next Thursday on October 19th, and then for the December, January, and February outlook, it'll be updated one more time on November the 16th. We do look out a year into the future, so we do 13 3-month overlapping seasons. So on November 16th, when we issue for the final time, the outlook for December, January, and February of 2017-18, we'll actually take a first look at the winter of 2018-19. And we try to make sure that there's some consistency. Obviously, when you're only advancing 1 month, 2 months are in common. so you shouldn't see large swings on the maps. So that's kind of what I would consider my basic housekeeping, and it's time to look back at last year's outlook. I don't believe we had this conference last year, so I didn't present it to you, but I'm sure folks were probably still cognizant and aware of what was going on. In terms of factors that potentially we were seeing that could influence last winter, well, folks probably remember back in 2015-16, we had one of the strongest El Niños, and that had dissipated as anticipated during the spring of 2016. We had a period of what we call ENSO neutral, and when we're talking about either El Niño or ENSO or La Niña, we're really talking about the circulation and the ocean temperatures across the Pacific Ocean. I won't go into a lot of detail, but what goes on across the Pacific Ocean oftentimes leads to impacts over the United States, over North America. And so at this time last year, we saw an elevated chance that La Nina would develop. It hadn't yet. It turns out that it did develop, although it was weak, and it probably did play some role in the outlook. Some of the other factors that folks are kind of they're popular in the mainstream media, so to speak, is something that's called either the Arctic Oscillation or the North Atlantic Oscillation. Can play significant roles in what happens during the winter, in particular in the eastern half of the nation. Folks might remember the winter of 2009-10 that saw huge swings towards the negative side of the Arctic Oscillation, a very, very cold and snowy winter across at least the eastern half of the nation. We also look to see what the trends have looked like in terms of how the recent period has done compared to our base period, that 1981 to 2010 period. Turns out that while there's little dispute that the planet has a warming trend, that trend can be variable in both space and time. And at this point, we really, and we'll look at the map a little later on, but the winter trends have been relatively small, so there's not a strong tilt towards that. And so the forecast that we issued last year was kind of weighted towards what our models show us, and we'll look at those again. But we did play up a little bit a weak La Nina. So what happened, and again, this was what we were looking at back in September of last year. So this again is kind of orienting folks. This is looking at the tropical Pacific Ocean. So on the right side, the white area there is actually South America, and to the north of that is Mexico. You can see Australia in the lower left corner. The blue box is kind of the key focus area for whether we will potentially see impacts from what's going on over the equatorial Pacific. At this point, back in late August of 2016, it was on the colder side, and so despite that, our models were kind of wishy-washy as to whether or not we would really see a La Nina develop. This is some of the models, and we'll look at updated plots for this to see what we expect to develop this coming year. On the left is what we call it's a chart of about 20 or 25 different model forecasts. If you look at where the circle is for December, January, and February, so you'll see, maybe about half of the models are below that -0.5 line, which is our threshold for La Nina. But there are a number of models that said we wouldn't see an event. Certainly, if you look at the right-hand figure, there's a more select amount of models, and maybe some of the better models are pulled out here. And you can see that whole solution is almost entirely above that -0.5 line. Played a pretty strong, at this point, influence in us really not favoring La Nina development. Turns out that we probably should have played up La Nina a little more, although maybe not a big factor. Interestingly enough, the La Nina we had last year that was weak kind of died out as we went through the winter. So maybe there was something to kind of a blend between these two different forecasts. Here's what the sea surface temperature departures or anomalies look like during January. So, it's actually a little bit on the little warmer than we were seeing back in August. If I had shown one of these from November, it would have been much bluer in that blue box, indicating that at that point we did have a La Nina. So our forecast here is from last year is on the left, and where we favored above average temperatures across, probably the southern, at least half of the country, a little bit more out west. And we did see the possibility of below average temperatures across, maybe parts of the northern plains, the western Great Lakes region. On the right is our temperature anomalies as to what happened. Folks maybe recall it's one of the warmest winters that we've seen on record. So, while our forecast was certainly skillful and positive, that Heidecke skill score that says it's 47.7, that's basically 45 to 50% better than just a guess, randomly guessing. So if you randomly guess in a 3-class system, you would expect to see a third of your forecast be correct. So a 47 is significantly better than that. Probably if there was any real error as well, not extending the tilt towards above average temperatures into the northeast that were fairly warm. And that area where we favored below average temperatures was again shifted further to the east than was actually occurred, with the Pacific Northwest really being the only significant part of the country that saw below average temperatures last winter. For those interested in precipitation, and this was noteworthy really only for what occurred out in California last year, as their 5 or 6 year significant, severe, I believe exceptional drought was brought to a surprising end, actually, as La Nina would not favor it to be wetter than average. The forecast from September didn't really have much to say about California. It basically was looking at kind of a coin toss, or a 3-sided coin, so to speak, as to anything going on. You can see that we favored, dry in the southeast, and some of that was correct, some of it was not correct. A little bit of a wet signal in parts of the north, and again, kind of a mixed bag signal. I would say there was some skillful, but not a tremendous forecast. So that's kind of the end of the look back, and so now it's time to look ahead as to what might be going on. Here again, we are in a situation somewhat similar to last year at this time, where we're kind of dancing on the edge of, La Nina. We're not quite there yet. Here are now the sea surface temperature departures. Again, the blue box is what we call our Nina 3.4 area. So there's some blues certainly in the eastern half of the box. The western half is more mixed, but all very much kind of near average. If you look, interestingly, further to the east, so between the edge of the blue box at what it says 120W, or 120 degrees west longitude, in the South American coast, it's actually colder in that area. This year, though, our models are kind of giving us a different story than we saw last year. So we do have a larger, or a greater chance that we will see La Nina this year. Did throw in a figure that I haven't shown in some years. Wanted to include it this year. This kind of looks back over the past year as to what's gone on in these different what we call Nino regions across the tropical Pacific. Nina 3.4, if you look in here now, I'm looking at the little box on the bottom on the left side of the plot. So you can see there's Nino 3 that's shaded in red, and Nino 4 shaded in yellow, and then there's kind of a hybrid box that encompasses some or both of those. If you look at the figure on the right, those are the last year of what average departures in those different boxes have looked like. And so certainly, again, if we focus on the second plot down, that Nina 3.4, you can see last year, about this time, October, November, we were down around -0.8. That was when we were kind of right in the peak of that weak La Nina. And you can see how it really weakened as we went through the winter. By the time we got into February, really, sea surface temperatures were back to normal. Then they increased, and there was some chatter, some thought that, gee, would we see El Nino? Some folks issued El Nino watches. We were just decided to watch instead of issuing anything formal. That appears to be the right decision, is by the time we got to late summer, we've kind of headed back towards cold. And if I had been doing this talk, maybe a month ago, you can see as the blue area was expanding downward in early September, would have been maybe more confident of La Nina to develop. But interestingly, the last couple of weeks have kind of backed off of that. So there is, some doubt as to whether we'll see La Nina. If we look at our models, and here, these were the same figure just updated that I had showed earlier. Again, the figure on the left, if we look at where the circle is for December, January, and February, that's what DJF stands for. I always have to remember to explain myself on those. But again, it looks a lot like last year, really. There's about half of the models are below minus 0.5 and maybe half are above 0.5, so kind of a split case. But interestingly, if we look at the figure now on the right, whereas last year, really the lines were almost all at or above the minus 0.5. Here, going through the heart of the winter, many of the models are below the line. Really, it looks like for December and January, they are all below the line. So it gives us a little more confident that this event will develop and persist through the winter and potentially impact what we expect to see. Talked a little bit about the North Atlantic Oscillation or Arctic Oscillation. Some folks, will hear, sometimes you'll hear in the news, the polar vortex, and these things are all related to each other. The reality is, while it can play a significant role in what happens during the winter, especially if it's very persistent in one phase or the other, it's still a real challenge to reliably forecast what the seasonal phase will be. And the reality is, a lot of years it's very changeable. So you'll get some cold periods that'll be consistent with the negative phase, and it'll last 2 or 3 weeks, and then we'll kind of flip, and you'll end up with a warm period when we'll see the positive phase. There's a lot of folks actively researching this. Maybe folks have heard possible links between this and snow cover over Siberia, a decrease in Arctic sea ice. Well, my thoughts on that are, and it's certainly something that we've looked at, and we don't, we're just not confident enough to really have that play any type of a role. I mean, the reality is that certainly Arctic sea ice has been on the decrease for a number of years. Coincident with that, we've seen a lot of snow cover over Siberia. This looks at that winter Arctic oscillation all the way back to 1950. And, other than the big departure back in 2009-10, really the last 2, 4, 6, 7 or 8 years have kind of been middling. If anything, they favored more a positive Arctic oscillation, which again would favor above average temperatures in the southeast and the east, as opposed to any type of a significant trend towards negative Arctic oscillation, which is what we hear a lot of times. So jury is still out on that. We kind of view the here at the Climate Prediction Center, the Arctic oscillation as a real wild card. We at this point don't really try to come up with what the phase will be, and it just basically it imparts some uncertainty into our forecast. I've talked about trends a little bit as to the way they're kind of been in terms of variations in time and space. We call it an optimal climate normal. Basically, the key word there is optimal, which basically says that if you were to try to uncover skill in this particular methodology, it turns out that comparing the last 15 years to your 30-year climatology maximizes that, really both for temperature and precipitation. I think I said it's not much help for us at this time because I'm looking at this map here. So this now compares temperature departures over the 15-year period. So from 2002 to 2016, so those 15 winters, to our 1981 to 2010 base period, you see a very white map. And so what that tells us is that at least for this season over the United States, trends have been, very, very mixed and very minimal, so that there's been pretty much an even balance of years that have been above average, kind of offset by years that have been below average. little bit of a tilt in California and in the Southwest, where you see those pink areas, and maybe a little bit of a tilt up in Maine. But for the most part, really the wintertime trends over the U.S. have been very small. So we now end up relying somewhat significantly on model forecasts. Here we're looking at some of what we consider our better models. These are from the NMME. It stands for the North American Multi-Model Ensemble. These are the forecasts for temperature that go along with those El Nino forecasts I showed earlier. These are the forecasts from September, so this is what our team was looking at here when we were issuing the forecast that I'll present in another few minutes. You know, for these types of maps, so certainly there's a lot of areas where we see above average temperatures, but interestingly, this is, to my eye, and looking at this for a number of years, this is actually one of the kind of what we would consider a colder solution. If you look, a lot of them have some blues up, at least in parts of Western Canada, extending down maybe into the Pacific Northwest or into parts of the Northern Plains, depending on the map. Some of them are really warm. If you look at in the lower left corner, there's a map from the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab that is pretty much favors above average temperatures everywhere. The blues on the map are actually very consistent with La Nina conditions. I won't show the typical La Nina response over North America for temperature, but if you look at a map like, maybe one of the two in the upper column, the two in the middle, or the one on the right that shows some of the blues and all, that's kind of what we oftentimes see in a lot of cases when we deal with La Nina. Now, given that today is October the 11th and this set of figures runs once a month and updates on the 8th, I was able to provide an update to that figure. And so we can see how things have changed. Some of them significantly, I would say, judging just looking at them in an eyeball sense, there's probably less blue on the map, so less areas favored to see below average temperatures. Some significantly, if we look at the two Canadian models in the middle, they're certainly much warmer. The top row on the left, that's the one that the National Weather Service runs, called the CFS, or the Climate Forecast System. That's actually a little bit cooler up in Canada. Does give us, maybe more of a forecast towards average temperatures across the Northern Plains and into the Pacific Northwest. If we look at, I'm going to advance ahead. If we look at the combination of all of those models, you can see on the left-hand column, a lot of reds on the map, oranges and reds. So these models are painting again a picture of another rather warm winter, almost coast to coast, except interestingly enough, in the areas that last winter were below average. This year, these forecasts are more in the average term. Some of the others are in terms of probabilities, and then some adjustments due to calibration. But really not a lot of support for below average temperatures. And so really the question for the forecasters is, where don't we favor above average temperatures? Having said that, just a refresher as to the outlook rationale. So we do think La Nina will develop, kind of giving a nod to our forecast models. I talked a little bit about the Arctic Oscillation potentially being a fly in the ointment. And having gone through all that, I will click ahead to the forecast. Remember, and the timing of this is, I won't say unfortunate, but we will be updating this forecast. We usually don't have huge swings in the forecast, so hopefully what comes out next Thursday will be somewhat similar to this. But one thing we don't favor below average temperatures anywhere. So really it's either a tilt towards above average temperatures, or in the areas that are less likely to be warm, parts of the Midwest, Northern Plains, Pacific Northwest. Those areas are just left as white or equal chances. I've got little helpful reminders that even in areas where the map shows orange, again, that means we lean or we favor that, but the probabilities for the most part are fairly modest. Really only down in where I have the example down in southern New Mexico, where the probability exceeds 50% is the color shown on the map actually more likely than the combination of the other two possible outcomes. So largely a tilt towards above, not wildly above. I know folks like to compare forecasts in terms of, for energy group, heating degree days, so I try to do that. The map here now is if you were to take the probabilities from this and you fit a distribution to it, and how far does the middle of the distribution shift. So again, given the probabilities are fairly small, the shift in the distribution is fairly small. The largest areas are only a degree Fahrenheit, kind of where that darker shade of pink is, and I have it highlighted. If we compare, if we sum the heating degree days for December, January, and February for this map based on these areas being this much above average, it's between about 1.7% less than our base period. But it's 12.4% more than last year, really highlighting just how extraordinarily warm last winter was. For those interested, this is the current Precip outlook. Again, a fairly, a tilt towards that La Nina that typically favors dry, at least from Texas along the Gulf Coast to Florida. Some indication of wetter than average conditions in parts of the northern parts of the U.S. And I mentioned that we do issue forecasts that go out a year. So if folks are interested in some of the other seasons, the December, January, and February, of course, that we've already seen is in the top middle on this particular map. But these are all of our outlooks from November, December, January of this year out through April, May, June of next year. Again, we save the ink, we save the blue ink for these maps at this point. Really no indication at this point of anywhere where we're favoring below average temperatures. Doesn't mean there won't be below average temperatures, and I would be stunned if there weren't below average temperatures anywhere. Again, while the planet as a whole might be warming, certainly the seasonal variability is much larger than that. And should we see, we're likely to see some periods during the winter and during really any of these seasons that will see colder than average temperatures. If I were showing, we've talked a little bit about last winter being warm. Well, this past summer, was actually modestly cool in parts of the country. Kind of had broken a fairly persistent period when temperatures over the U.S. were far dominated by above versus below average temperatures. So I might have a couple of minutes. I just want to quickly go through what I'm calling our subseasonal outlooks. It's a challenging forecast for sure. The shorter period outlooks we do here, maybe looking back at week 2, it's kind of an extension of a weather forecast in terms of understanding what the circulation and having a decent handle as to how the circulation that goes from today through week 2 progresses, and we have some ability to do that based on the initial starting conditions. The monthly and seasonal are really dependent more on things like what the ocean is doing in terms of El Nino or La Nina, or possibly soil moisture or snow cover, different things like that. It's what we call the boundary layer. Week 3 and week 4 is plumb in the middle, so you really don't get a whole lot of predictability, as it says in point 1, from that atmospheric initial condition, which is critical to making the forecast for tomorrow or later this week or even next week. But it doesn't necessarily benefit from the slowly evolving parts like we talked about, like the ocean. So we started doing this back in September of 2015. We had a fair amount of success with temperature outlooks, and those became operational earlier this year on May the 19th. It's a product that our tempo is a little different than some of our other products, whereas the seasonal products are done once a month and the week 2 products are done every day. We do this week 3 and week 4 product once a week. So it's released every Friday at about 3 o'clock. Something else that's different about it is instead of it being a 3-class system, so instead of dividing the potential outcomes into thirds, we divided it only in half. So you're either above or below average. And so the maps look like these. We simplified the color scheme. On the left, again, is temperature. So anything in red is a tilt towards above, and anything in blue is a tilt towards below. Again, we do have the ability, when there's not really an indication, to kind of just say equal chances in this case. Instead of equal chances being 1/3 for any of 3 outcomes, it's simply a flip of a coin, 50-50 for above or below. Just thought I'd show how we've been doing with these regionally. This is looking at a year's worth of forecasts, so 52 forecasts. In this case, oranges, reds are good. Blues are not so good. Fortunately, there's a lot more reds and just a few spots of blue or white on the map. So at least in terms of temperature, we've been fairly successful. The best forecasts have really been across the south and maybe up into the mid-Atlantic and along the west coast, and certainly up over Alaska. We've had a fair amount of success. Precip, again, always more challenging. Here's a case where there's, maybe more in the yellows than blues, but still not overwhelmingly so. And at this point, the precipitation outlooks are still experimental. We'll see whether that kind of migrates to being operational at some point in the next year or so. And with that, I will stop, and I'm not sure who I'm turning it back to, but I'm available for any questions.
Thank you, Mike. This is Dave Terry, and thanks again for, as always, an excellent presentation, good data and information. I think I'm reminded toward the end, the heating degree days and comparison with last year's temperatures. I think sometimes, particularly in thinking about lower income and moderate income folks that have affordability of energy is a big concern coming into the heating season. In particular, a variation from one year to the next is important to them, and certainly to our states that serve that community as well. And I think we've definitely, at least I can see in the data you provide over the years, the increasingly better forecasts, better data, better knowledge that you all present, and certainly better than the kind of nostalgic indicators that I learned on the farm growing up. So I'm glad we have that. While folks are thinking about their questions, if we have any, I do have one quick one, Mike. As the forecast is updated in November, does the statistical accuracy of that tend to improve as you get closer to that December, January time frame, or is it maybe just more detailed? Is there sort of a trend there in terms of accuracy, or is it simply more detailed in how it's presented?
At this time of the year, I would say it probably isn't a huge difference, largely because the factors that are likely to influence the winter, things like El Nino or La Nina, are oftentimes clear, and so we know what to expect. In a case like this year, given where we're kind of on the edge, certainly could play a role. I think certainly the outlooks within a couple of months of the season are more skillful than those issued, 6 months or a year. I mean, they all have some level of skill, but certainly as we get closer to the season and we have a better understanding as to what's going on across the Pacific Ocean in particular, and as well as maybe some additional skill from our models, certainly get a little bit better. But by the time we get into the September, October time range, you typically don't see big changes in the forecast. So they're all pretty much on par.
Terrific. Thank you. Shamika, do we have any questions from our panel or from the audience?
Yes, I actually have a couple of questions that came in through the chat pane. The first one is from Alice Lippert. Mike, I assume the products are easy to find on the NOAA website?
Yes. My first slide certainly has our webpage. The the first lead outlook, which from September was actually October, November, December, is made available right on the front page. The rest of the outlooks, all you need to do is from the front page, click on the words 3-month outlook. It takes you to a table, and then it's just a matter of clicking a link and you'll get whatever outlook you want to see.
Great. So the next question is from Brandon Bowser. Could you quickly recap the winter 2017-2018 precipitation projections again?
Sure. At this point, really leveraging a developing La Nina, we favor below average precipitation across, parts of the South from Texas, maybe the eastern parts of New Mexico, on across the Gulf Coast to Florida and up the East Coast to as far north as North Carolina. Precipitation, we tilt towards above average precipitation in the Midwest, in the Pacific Northwest, the Northern Rockies, and in Western Alaska. Areas that I didn't mention at this point are just termed at equal chances, so that there's really no tilt towards any of the three outcomes.
Great. The last question I have is from Katie Pegan. Have you seen any significant changes in the averages you use for helping to predict both temperature and precipitation over time?
I'm not exactly sure of where that question is going. I will say certainly that having been in the business for, too long, we certainly can see some improvement in our skill. Some of that is driven by improvements in the computer models that I showed earlier. The North American multi-model ensemble has been a big help to us and really, when folks are comfortable with the weather forecast, they have to realize that we've had weather models, that started back probably over 50 or 60 years ago, that those have been in development. And climate models, were probably more in the 10 or 20 year range. So that really, I think, further improvement in development will hopefully be coming as our computers become more powerful and we're able to go to running more complicated and higher resolution simulations.
Great. So that's all the questions that I have, David.
Alrighty, thank you, Shamika. Thank you again, Mike. We look forward to following up and the forecast updates that you noted. Next, we have Eric Lee, Senior Energy Analyst with Citi Commodities Research. Eric is an analyst on Citi's team, looking at a variety of commodities activities, particularly oil prices. And we've had certainly Eric and his colleagues provide presentations in the past. These are really an excellent private sector look at what we expect in energy markets. With that, I'll turn it over to Eric, and you can certainly review his full bio when we post that online. Eric?
Thanks very much. So thank you for having me today. I wanted to give a brief overview on Citi's outlook for oil and gas markets and prices as we move into the winter and through 2018. I'm going to refer to the slides as I go through them. So starting on slide 1, we have a table of our commodity price outlooks, and the first 3 rows give us Brent and WTI and our Henry Hub natural gas outlook. Our outlook really is for, just to give the price outlook, is for Brent crude oil prices at $58 on average in 4Q17, $55 in 1Q18, and an average of 54 in 2018 as a whole. WTI is seen at basically about $4 lower. That's to say we're a little bullish in the near term, but as we look over the next few years, we are modestly bearish on oil prices before being a bit more constructive over the 2020 to 2022 period, where we're looking for more like $60 levels for crude oil prices in our base case. As for natural gas, our outlook for Henry Hub is for $3.50 in the fourth quarter of this year, $3.20 per MMBTU in the first quarter of next year, and easing to an average of $3 for 2018 as a whole. And thus, we're also, of course, bullish into the winter for natural gas prices. And I'll talk a bit more about that after oil. Moving to slide 3, we are near-term bullish for oil because we expect inventories broadly to continue drawing into 2018 as the rebalancing process continues for oil markets after the 2014 to 2016 oil price crash. Additionally, we see several other factors that point to upside risk over this winter and going into 2018. One part is actually the ongoing aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. Another is a rising in global geopolitical tensions, albeit all of this incentivizes a fairly robust shale supply response, also, of course, centered in the US. The recent devastation wrought by Hurricane Harvey hit US Gulf Coast communities hard. The refining sector wasn't spared. The disruption to refined product supplies has led to tighter product inventories in the US, but also elsewhere, since the US Gulf Coast is now also a significant refined product exporter to the world. Strong refinery margins as a result of that have boosted refinery utilization globally, where it's been able to rise. And in the US, some of the fall maintenance that's usually done seasonally by refiners is also being deferred in some cases as well to next year. So this keeps crude demand strong around the world, and to some extent maybe stronger than expected over the fall maintenance season for refineries. Meanwhile, the drop in refinery runs in the US relatively to a boost globally has also helped widen the price differential between Brent and WTI. So WTI had been as low as $6 below Brent recently, rather than say $3–4 otherwise. Some infrastructure issues on the Gulf Coast also have been keeping that wide as well. But as a result of a widespread where it's been possible, US crude exports have surged, and we saw that hit a record 2 million barrels a day over the last week or two. On slide 4, we can see that even before the storm, oil markets were rebalancing well, despite the kinds of headlines that we see sometimes in news flow, and particularly in terms of comments from OPEC, which we'll talk more about later. Weekly and monthly inventories data basically have showed stronger than seasonal draws, pretty much for most months out of the year, and these stocks are drawing down. On slide 5, we can see that physical crude markets also reflected this tightening in the markets. End user demand, drivers, industrial sectors, etc., for oil have also been doing well and keeping global refinery margins pretty strong, including for the more marginal simple refineries, such as those in Europe. So that's shown in bottom right of the graph. Simple refinery margins have also been performing well, and they tend to be the marginal ones. So utilization has been high. Even more marginal refiners have been brought into the mix. On slide 6, we have seen higher than recent averages for refinery outages in the Americas, really in Latin America, and then of course due to Hurricane Harvey. But that to some extent has also supported refinery margins. And over to slide 7. So broadly, it comes down to the supply-demand balances. We have a truncated version on this slide. They show further tightening inventories this year, but this does ease in 2018. All of the kind of supply and demand row items boil down to the pink highlighted area on the table, and as you can see, pretty strong draws through 2Q to 4Q of 2017, but 2018 is much more fluctuating around a more flat level, right? We do make some adjustments there for things like strategic inventory stockpiling, say in China particularly, as well as operational oil requirements from new refinery capacity and pipeline infrastructure, as well as seasonal data discrepancies. So that's why when you subtract demand from supply, you might still get a more positive number. We then see additional oil that's taken out of the market for other reasons that we think are important in showing how tight markets are right now. The other part is then thinking about these inventories. We tend to look at it, of course, we count the absolute barrels that there are, and in that sense, inventories do stabilize in 2018 in our balances. But in days of cover terms, these are expected to continue to tighten. In any case, the continued whittling down of inventories through 2017 is supportive of oil prices, whether on a flat price basis, but particularly on a time spreads basis. In other words, front month crude oil prices are expected to stay strong relative to deferred prices. We see that particularly in the Brent futures oil curve, which is clearly sort of much higher at the front than the back, and WTI has a few months where we see contango, but then even that moves into a backwardated curve after a few months ahead in terms of futures contracts. On slide 8, just a little more on these inventory metrics, because they tell us, they can tell, you know, if you focus on the absolute level, it can look like inventories are flattening out in 2018. If you look at it on a days of cover basis, it continues to tighten. The kind of divergence of that kind of view is in bottom left. You know, ultimately, we think the days of cover are more important. You know, inventories are there in a sense as, you know, a number of days that you can, you know, in some say, you know, how many days could you use oil until you run out if you got no more of it, or by another measure, you could look at how many days of imports do our inventories cover. You know, do we have a cushion to support that kind of you know, relative disruptions. Moving to slide 9, there are two big factors, of course, that do influence more bullish or more bearish scenarios going forward. One side is OPEC, right? OPEC and the petrostates, including Russia. And the other side is Shale, Shale producers in the US. On geopolitics, I mean, all eyes are now on the petrostate deal, which of course includes OPEC countries like Saudi Arabia, as well as Russia and other non-OPEC producers. They banded together late last year to enact a joint production cut, which started on January 1st this year, and of course that's continued. This does look more. The current plan had been to for this to end in March 2018, but a lot of news flow, a lot of announcements coming out of this producer group is talking about extending the production cuts beyond March 2018, perhaps to mid-year or even to year end. Saudi Arabia has made cryptic statements about, you know, extraordinary measures to try to balance markets, which also raises the specter of other potential wildcards here. But other than planned OPEC production policy, there also continues to be bullish geopolitical risks to oil supply from a number of other places. The US, of course, considering decertifying the Iran nuclear deal. If what that plays out in more extreme cases, then you could see a renewal of Iran sanctions, which could take off, which when it was on, took off about 1 million barrels a day of oil off the market. Another one is the current issue in Iraq. And you know, any sort of Iraq or Iraqi or Turkish response to the recent Kurdish referendum on independence could cut off, again, in terms of a tail risk, 500,000 barrels a day of supply. And there are, of course, ongoing issues in Venezuela. Libya and Nigeria could also see supply docked back as well. So there are numerous bullish supply risks that are out there. Meanwhile, nuclear tensions with North Korea, of course, are also looming. Although at first blush, escalation there could end up being disruptive more to oil demand than to oil supply, for what that's worth. Broadly on the bearish side, the end of the OPEC production cuts means some return of OPEC and Russian barrels to the market, and so that would need to be carefully managed. But no matter what, that remains a bearish future weight on the market. Moving to slide 10. The response of US shale producers, of course, is critical. They are now, I think, well recognized as really the new swing producers in the world, right? Particularly in the short term. When prices are higher, we've seen them already tick up the amount of rig counts that are being allocated, as well as production that's coming out of the sector. And of course, we saw them cut back production significantly 2014 over to 2016, when prices were very low, hit as low as $26, $27 per barrel in February of last year. So the response of shale is critical. We do continue to see a robust supply response from the sector, growing perhaps some 800 and 900,000 barrels a day in 2018. I mean, what we're seeing on the slide is some of our equity research colleagues look at key companies in the sector, and of course they've been improving their cost structures as reported in continued earnings calls as they've come out. However, they've also been expressing some issues with production, with management of sand and water and trucking, that mean that their production guidance may start to be revised down somewhat as well. And I think the market is also broadly revising down its over-exuberant view as to the amount of shale production growth that's possible next year. Nevertheless, it's still robust. A medium-term issue over time is also going to be, as production, a lot of the shale production is focused in West Texas in the Permian Basin on the oil side. And one of the bottlenecks there in the future is going to be whether, of course, well, on one hand, oil pipelines are built out at fast enough rate to be able to take away any oil produced in the sector to demand centers or to export centers. A less focus is paid to gas pipeline outlets from the Permian Basin, but that could be a constraint as well. Essentially, the Permian Basin sees a lot of shale oil being produced, but there's associated gas that's produced alongside the oil. This is essentially a byproduct, essentially is offered for free, but also, cannot be just recklessly flared. It needs to move somewhere, and you need the gas infrastructure to take it out. That could also be a constraint on oil production, as another link between the oil and gas sectors. One of the issues that commonly over the winter season, winter conditions can cause some slowdown in shale development activity. So we could see a little bit of a slowdown just through the winter months due to difficult weather conditions, freeze-offs of wells, etc. Figure 11 shows some of the projections. I mean, we try we spend a good amount of time thinking about what shale production looks like at different price levels, what oil rig counts look like at different price levels, because it's such a driver of global market pricing for oil. The thing to note here is that, particularly on the lower two graphs, the potential for cost inflation now in the shale sector, rather than the cost deflation we saw in the last few years, could lower the production outlook somewhat as well. On slide 12, a note is that in the very near term, let's say over the next week or two, there are probably a few sort of bearish headwinds, and this is really just looking at financial market positioning in the futures and options of crude oil and products. These have, since the oil price rallies recently, have come alongside a movement of money managers into the sector, and length or number of long positions held on net by them has started to hit higher levels again, and so there could be some give back in prices just on a short-term basis, but we think the fundamentals continue to point upwards. On slide 13, two other factors: China crude imports, and we talked about global oil supply disruptions earlier. The issue of China, particularly for this winter period, fourth quarter of this year, is that, of course, Chinese consumer demand is very strong. They have significant refinery capacity that serves that demand and pulls in crude imports from around the world. China recently put a cap on the export quotas for these refineries in the country. That means that there's limited amount they can export of products. That might limit the amount of refinery activity and in turn the amount of Chinese crude imports that move into the country to be processed into refined products. Now, given strong refinery margins, there could be higher crude imports than expected if either export quotas are raised or there's some other way for Chinese refiners to try to capture those strong refinery margins. On slide 14, a note on the medium-term oil outlook. Shale is clearly a strong swing producer now within the market, maybe arguably much more than OPEC is or can be. When we think over a few years, we're thinking about incentive pricing for shale producers. How much shale supply is needed to meet oil demand growth, as well as declines in legacy oil production. and what price would you need to bring that on? And really, when we look at that, $40 to $60 really provides most of the range where shale production either grows more slowly or declines somewhat, or grows pretty substantially, enough to balance global oil markets in a range of scenarios. We do run also shock scenarios. If you lose 1 million barrels a day of supply somewhere in the world, you can see it's something like what we think is a $10 spike in oil prices for about a year. But actually, after a year, the shale supply response can really bring prices back to the baseline trajectory that they otherwise would have been on. So broadly speaking, of course, these geopolitical supply shocks are potential is there, but shale more than ever is able to provide some market rebalancing to it that's relatively effective. Moving over to natural gas, here we'll talk a lot more about weather. From the oil side, actually, a lot more of the drivers of pricing even over the winter period is much more related to geopolitics and shale response. I'll note, although that, of course, that heating oil stocks in the US, particularly in the Northeast, are lower than they've been over the past year. Part of it is because of the refinery disruptions in the Gulf Coast and less refined product supply. Nevertheless, since the glut in oil markets that we saw a few years ago, heating oil and distillate and diesel stocks on the whole are still relatively high compared to the last few years. So they're not tight, not very tight by any means. That said, retail diesel prices do look to be higher than last year, but that's much more of a function of the crude oil price pickup on one hand and stronger refinery margins in the aftermath of Harvey. Looking at natural gas, the major weather drivers, of course, are weather, but also we'll talk a bit about shale supply, including from associated gas from the oil sector, and demand, where we see rising demand over the year, including the winter. Recent milder weather, of course, had helped Henry Hub natural gas prices ease, but our broad view is that we're again also short-term bullish. We do think that the winter has upside risk for prices, and this is really thinking the way we think about this is looking at projected inventories, of course, under different weather scenarios for the winter. In our base case, March 2018 natural gas inventories could be as low as 1.2 TCF, and then as we project out to October 2018, up to 3.4 TCF. So not glutted by any stretch. In the winter case, we really stress we look at 36 years of weather scenarios, and the short point I'll make first before I go into it deeper is that one standard deviation colder or milder winter can lead to March 2018 gas inventories being some 500 BCF higher if weather's milder, or 500 BCF lower if the winter is colder by a standard deviation. 500 BCF lower, of course, is pretty tight. That would mean March 2018 could see gas inventories in 0.7 TCF level, which is dangerously low. A higher, a milder winter could lead to higher inventories at say 1.7 TCF, and that to us is really merely a balanced market, and with concomitant prices in the high $2 per MMBTU level, rather than particularly much lower than that. On slide 16, we delve a bit deeper into the weather scenario analysis. You can see, on the top two graphs, the cumulative distribution curve of possible March 2018 and October 2018 natural gas inventories, and the dotted line shows the 50th percentile. And so there's sort of this upside skew, we think, upside risk within this kind of picture. When we translate that to a trajectory over time for gas inventories for these different weather scenarios over the past 36 years, we see a graph that looks something like the bottom left. And then when we translate that to think about what natural gas price strip would you need to then retarget 1.3 TCF in March 18, we see a graph that looks like bottom right, in terms of pricing. And again, the risk looks skewed to the upside. A more extreme winter scenario could see natural gas prices spike some $2 per MMBTU above the current level. And the downside risk is more to pricing is more limited in our view. Jumping ahead to slide 18, of course, while Henry Hub prices are the main prices that we forecasted here, other price points also are driven by particularly by local production versus pipeline takeaway. And looking at price differentials in the Marcellus region, such as the Dominion South and Transco Leidy price points, you can see that these continue, of course, to be pressured, lower to have a discount relative to Henry Hub, really reflective of pipeline costs or bottlenecks where they appear, and are some, not quite, $1 below Henry Hub, depending on where you're looking. Over time, this will continue to require pipeline build out in order to keep from being discounted much more heavily relative to Henry Hub, as well as needing to, but also not just pipeline takeaway, but also gas and gas competition from other regions, including Canada, will be determining, what those price discounts might look like. On slide 19, on the demand side, demand is climbing. So on the industrial side, on the top right, you can see that petchem facilities, for instance, the build out in 2017 has been really substantial, representative of some potential 0.5 BCF a day of natural gas demand. And actually that, as those have opened up, full effect of that growing demand should be felt in 2018. Meanwhile, LNG projects, even as we speak, are about to ramp up further as well. And if you add to that potential accelerated denuclearization of the power plants, this points to a robust demand growth outlook for 2018, winter notwithstanding. And jumping all the way to slide 21, just to complete the picture on the global side. Again, broadly, we of course expect a rise in prices over the winter period. Part of that has been helped by high thermal coal prices, putting a higher floor on the gas prices globally. Higher thermal coal prices being driven by a tighter Chinese market recently due to some policy changes there. Also, positive demand surprises globally in terms of weather or otherwise can overwhelm LNG supply in the short term, given that unlike, say, in oil, there's no spare capacity in LNG. And so that could mean, LNG prices up to some $10 per MMBTU globally. And these levels are less sort of reflective of oil index prices and more from potential gas to oil substitution, where oil-fired power generation kicks in at higher global gas price levels, and that's what helps drive the pricing on that scale. But LNG supply does keep rising globally in 2018, including out of the US. And meanwhile, Japan is also doubling its nuclear power generation as well throughout the year or into early 2019. So there are some offsets to that from the demand side. So to sum up, the winter outlook and the look for oil and gas markets out to 2018, in our view, are capped by shale production on very importantly on one side, but present near-term bullish risks. Prices for oil and heating oil and gasoline are higher than last year already, partially due to crude and what we think will be ongoing strong refinery margins. And on the natural gas side, even with a sort of 50-50 colder or milder winter, the price risk in our view is still skewed to the upside. So with that, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Eric. That's terrific. The analysis here, both in the complex areas of oil and natural gas, really excellent. We appreciate that. We are open to questions now. I do have a quick question just to start us off, one in the oil space and one in the natural gas. In the oil area, you mentioned a decline in the days of cover. What's the sort of driver behind that decline? Is it exceptional, or is it just not a particularly concerning factor? Is it more demand or supply? Then I guess the second question on the natural gas side is just the potential for a colder than normal winter. If we have that, does that present any particular storage issues that we should be concerned about relative to the last couple of winters? Thank you.
Sure. In terms of drivers of tightening oil inventories, that is really an ongoing process since 2014. For instance, actually in the slides on slide 3 on top right, on the top right graph, I mean, what you can see is 2010 to 13. I mean, global observable oil inventories were fairly flat in absolute terms. That actually means, of course, that in days of cover terms, they were tightening. And of course, inventories just really bloated out in 2015. But you can see in 2016 already that it was already flattish, if not declining towards the end of the year. That was then helped by the OPEC production cuts. Although, broadly speaking, as I mentioned, that maybe accelerated the rebalancing, but it slows down. It presents a lower price outlook relative to benchmark later on. It's not a free lunch for them anymore because of the Shale supply response. So part of that is ongoing demand growth, and with the sharp drop in oil prices since 2014-15, oil demand had surged in the US, Europe, and other OECD countries. It had actually slowed down in the OPEC countries, where, as you can imagine, lower oil prices led to actually lower economic activity in those oil-producing countries, and actually much lower oil demand from there. But oil demand continued to grow, and then meanwhile, shale supply pulled back significantly here in the US, and then OPEC made some substantial cuts at the beginning of this year. So that's kind of all coming in to pull inventories down, and demand continues to grow while supply is growing much more modestly. On the natural gas side, I think it's in terms of where inventories can go. I think that it's really again pointing to looking at the kind of distribution of the past winters. Thinking of colder than whichever 10 or 30-year normal that you want to take. The inventory outlook, particularly for March 18, can get pretty low, right? And as I mentioned, just sort of one standard deviation, just as a kind of statistical place to put a marker, could lead to 500 BCF lower than projected in March. So instead of 1.2 TCF down to 700 BCF. And so that is that's a dangerously low level compared to recent years.
Thank you. Very helpful. Shamika, do we have other questions?
Yes. So I have a couple of questions. The first one is from John Powell. Slide 12 shows U.S. LNG delivered to Europe at $4 MMBTU, with Henry Hub at $3 MMBTU. Does the $4 MMBTU include liquefaction, freight, and revaporization?
Slide 12. Or probably slide 21. Well, in any case, yes, it does include all those things, except for the sunk costs.
Great. Next question is from Christy Manning. Eric, given China's decision to completely phase out fossil fuel power vehicles by 2040, when do you see China's domestic demand for oil to decline?
I'm not going to give a specific year or date. I think the trend is really clear that we can no longer take for granted that oil demand will just continue to grow for a very long period of time. This is particularly troubling for, of course, oil producers, whether companies, but particularly countries that are wholly, whose government revenues are wholly dependent on oil. The recognition that environmental policies need to change to address climate change is being felt most places around the world. A shift to and the shifts are now happening in of course a bunch of sectors, but including the transportation sector. And the transportation sector, until more recently, had always been seen as a stronghold for oil demand. So it's really meaningful that China, but also certain European countries and car manufacturers have talked about phasing out fossil fuel-based cars. Now, with transportation representing some 50% of global oil demand, that disruption is potentially very large. Then you sort of get into the kind of, what's the path between now and there? What policies are in place that would shift the kind of pricing and incentives? What technologies will be available such that consumers or any one of us can think, what type of car do I want to drive? Do I even need to drive in the car? I mean, of course, the onset of driverless cars may well change the way, may widely change the way transportation works. But all of this is to say that, one measure of it's going to think of is by thinking about the car fleet, right? In the US and in China, altogether, there are some 400 million cars, right? If you build a certain number of electric vehicles or other alternative fuel vehicles per year, how quickly does that mean the fleet moves towards alternatives? There's likely to be a kind of S-curve, which means that at first, there's this kind of slower sort of uptake, and then it sort of accelerates into a much faster uptake. If that's the case, then maybe it's later in the 2020s that we start seeing much bigger year-on-year changes. And even if the amount of electric vehicles on the road grows quickly in the next few years, let's say to 2020, the impact on oil demand, at least in the next 5 years, is relatively small. But that change could accelerate later on. Then you get to the sort of tricky questions of, okay, once you start shifting away, that's really meaningful. Then you may be left with very cheap oil, very low oil prices or cheap gasoline prices. To what extent, does that try to compete itself back into the sector? You end up with sort of a lot of like interrelated factors to take into account when thinking about that.
Great. Last question. You noted that natural gas infrastructure pipe restraints. Are there similar restraints in the shipping industry that could impact imports or exports?
So I think that's that matters both on the oil and gas side, but I think I mentioned it more on the gas side in the slides earlier. For now, the constraints. U.S. natural gas and U.S. shale gas has, resource-wise, is really massive. And if anything, it's global demand and then access to that global demand that really constrains it, right? In a very sort of top-down sort of way, thinking about it. Or to put another way, if you gave higher prices, if producers in, say, the Marcellus could achieve higher natural gas prices, they could produce at faster rates. So they do have pipelines that need to be built to move out of those regions. They do have to compete against other gas on the North American continent. Then they need outlets elsewhere, right? So here's where it moves to, any domestic U.S. demand that's coming from industrial facility build out. To some extent, that's relatively visible because we can just watch and count facilities and look at when they come online. They can be exported by pipeline to Mexico, and the pipelines are there and continue to grow, but there can be constraints downstream from there. So it's to some extent the ability for Mexico to take the gas over the border, but then also take it to where it's needed within the country. There are a lot of internal pipelines in Mexico that yet to be built out. Power generation, part of the growing Mexican natural gas demand comes from shift away from fuel oil power generation there to natural gas power generation, and that has a timeline as well. And so as new gas-fired power plants come online and the connectivity within gas pipes within Mexico is there, that can help boost the pull out of gas out of the US, and of course then the LNG terminals, and there essentially that of course is a major factor. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call it a bottleneck, but as additional LNG export facilities come online, you need the pipes to get there, and then it can be exported. Then you get to questions of, well, how much does the world need? And then the constraint there is actually that, remember, of course, once you put it on the water, you need it to be regas terminals, basically LNG import terminals elsewhere. And really out into the 2020s, there's a massive oversupply of LNG on the water relative to LNG import capacity. Let alone, that is really the main constraint. So an LNG glut in 2020s is ultimately the kind of constraint on natural gas in the US.
Great. David, I do not have any other questions.
Okay, thank you, Shamika. And Eric, thank you again for your thoughts and analysis today and the whole city team. We're going to move on now to our presenter from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. And before I turn it to John, just one more shout out to the EIA team. The data and analysis, the independent outlook that EIA has brought to the energy policy and planning space has been extraordinarily important to the states and private sector for many years. And I think in particular, as we have seen the spate of hurricanes that the Southeast, Texas, and Puerto Rico have dealt with, the energy data that we get from EIA as states, also for the territories, is invaluable. So a thank you to them before we turn it over to John. John Conti is the acting administrator of EIA. John has been filling in that capacity since September and leads EIA's analytical efforts in that regard. John will be followed by Tim Hess, product manager and short-term energy supply outlook for EIA, to provide some additional details. So we'll turn to John first. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today for this webinar. Just a few minutes, Tim Hess, EIA's product manager for the short-term energy outlook, will present an overview of the winter fuels outlook, which provides EIA's projections on energy pricing and expenditures for the 2017-18 winter heating season. I want to thank Tim and the entire EIA team who put together the short-term energy and winter fuels outlook for their hard work in ensuring that EIA produces high-quality information that helps NASEO members better plan for the winter heating season and meet the needs of their constituents. A lot of effort goes into preparing this document, and I am grateful for the quality of the information presented in it each year. I also want to recognize the collaborative efforts of EIA and the state's energy professionals who have made the state heating oil and propane update an ongoing success. This survey is incredibly useful in helping states and federal decision makers navigate the winter heating season. As you may already know, we expanded the SHOP survey last year to include wholesale propane prices for 10 additional states, including Maryland, Georgia, Kentucky, Michigan, Oklahoma, Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, and Colorado. Last, but certainly not least, I'd like to thank David Terry, Shamika Spencer, and Jeff Genzer of NASEO for suggesting and organizing this webinar. EIA has greatly enjoyed collaborating with NASEO for over 20 years in conducting the annual Winter Fuels Outlook briefing. We look forward to continuing this partnership with NASEO as it provides a valuable service for both the states and EIA in understanding our energy markets. Now, without further ado, I give you Tim Hess, who will provide an overview of the EIA's Winter Fuels Outlook.
Thank you, John, and thanks to NASEO for hosting this webinar. As John noted, EIA's Winter Fuels Outlook provides a look at EIA's projections of energy consumption, expenditures, and prices for the winter 2017-18, and tries to put that in the context of last winter and recent winters. The two main components of winter heating fuel expenditures are temperature and price. And one of the things you're going to find, throughout this outlook is that generally temperatures are expected to be colder than last winter, and prices are forecast to be higher. So EIA is forecasting expenditures to generally be higher than last winter. But the other thing you'll find is that when you compare it to a longer period, say the previous 5 winters or the previous 10 winters, this winter starts to look more like an average winter. The last 2 winters were somewhat anomalously warm, and that coincided with relatively low oil and gas prices. So that created a somewhat of a 2-year period where expenditures were low. But again, another thing to keep in mind is that weather is an extremely important variable, and as Mike Halpert from NOAA pointed out earlier, there's quite a wide range of weather outcomes that we could see. Now, one thing to also keep in mind when we're going through this is that EIA uses NOAA's heating degree day forecast for the winter. However, we take the heating degree day forecast and we change what we consider normal slightly from what their definition is. So EIA uses a 10-year, preceding 10-year average definition of normal, where the slides that were shown earlier were based on a 30-year 1981 to 2010 definition of normal. Additionally, EIA's winter runs from October to March, where NOAA's winter, as defined by in Mike's slides earlier, runs from December through February. So here is the EIA's forecast for winter temperatures based on the NOAA heating degree day forecast. And you can see the dark column on the right is this year's forecast compared with the previous winters for each month, and that graph on the right, the total winter, shows the total for the whole winter, and that dotted box is the 10-year average. And this really does show how anomalously warm last winter and the winter of 2015-16 were. In fact, NOAA reported that the December through February period last year was the 6th warmest on record, and that the December through February period in 2015-16 was the warmest on record. So again, this year, based on the NOAA's heating degree day forecast, we're expecting there to be 13% more heating degree days than last winter, but that for the whole winter, heating degree days are going to be slightly below the 10-year average. And you can see where this year each of those dark bars on the right are slightly lower than the 10-year average for most of the months. Slide 4 shows the prices for the major heating fuels on a dollars per million BTU basis. So on a heat content basis, so that you're comparing apples to apples across the fuels. And again, prices are supposed to be up somewhat from last year, particularly for heating oil and propane, which are that dark blue column and the middle blue column. And and that is really a reflection of higher crude oil prices, higher forecast crude oil prices this winter compared with last winter. And natural gas, that light blue column, sees less of a change, or sees less of a forecast change this winter over last winter. In fact, it's fairly similar to recent winters, right around $10 per million BTU. And these, again, are the residential prices. One thing to remember is that changes in crude oil prices tend to filter through more quickly to the retail heating oil and propane prices compared with, say, natural gas prices, where because of rate structures and other things, the changes in wholesale prices tend to be passed through more slowly to the retail side. Slide 5 is a table that shows for each of the fuels the expected percentage change in expenditures compared with last winter, the right-hand column, and with the previous 5-year average, the left column. And you can see compared with last year, all of the fuels are expected to see higher expenditures this year, which range from 8% to electricity to 18% for propane. But when you move to comparing it with the previous 5-year average, the changes are smaller. Natural gas and electricity about 6% higher than the 5-year average, propane 2% higher, and then heating oil 14% lower than the 5-year average. Slide 6. So EIA also does, to recognize the kind of the uncertainty in temperature outcomes and their importance in determining actual realized expenditures, does a case where heating degree days are 10% warmer than, or 10% fewer, or 10%, which is 10% warmer than forecast, or heating degree days are 10% higher or 10% colder than forecast. And so this table compares expenditures in those two scenarios with the base case. So the base case is the same data we showed in the right-hand column of the previous slide. And you can see that, as would be expected, if it's 10% colder than forecast, expenditures are expected to be higher than in the base case. But if in a 10% warmer than forecast scenario, you see temperatures that are expected to be, expenditures that are expected to be still higher than last year. And that's because last year was, more than 10% warmer than this year's forecast. EIA does attempt to break things down regionally in our outlook, because different fuels have different concentrations in the various regions. So this graph just shows the share of households in each region that use a particular heating fuel as their primary space heating fuel. And you can see that fuels like natural gas is relatively important across the regions, but some fuels are more regionally concentrated. For instance, electricity in the south and heating oil in the northeast. So quickly going to look at run through the various fuels and look at the forecast for those. I won't linger on these introductory slides. It's mostly text, and you can look at those once this content's available online. And I will somewhat probably sound like a broken record as we go through this, but weather is actual realized temperatures are a really important determinant to keep in mind when looking at expenditures and looking at what actual expenditures might be compared with what our forecast for expenditures are in this outlook. So the left-hand graph on slide 11 shows the regional share of U.S. households that use natural gas as a primary space heating fuel. So about 47% of all U.S. households use natural gas as their primary space heating fuel, which is about 60 million households. So of that 60 million, about 30% are in the Midwest, 26% in the West, 24% in the South, and 20% in the Northeast. And then the table at right shows the regional, the forecast regional change from last year for consumption price and then total expenditures. Consumption, again, expected to be up throughout the regions. The region that is expected to see the largest increase in consumption is the South, at 20% higher than last winter. And that's because the South, temperatures in the South are expected to be 27% colder than last winter. The South was the winter that saw kind of of all the regions that saw anomalously warm winters last year, that was most true about the South. And then average prices are a little bit more of a mixed bag, but for the U.S. as a whole, prices are expected to be up 2% versus last winter. So for total expenditures, that means you could see expenditures up 4% in the West, 13% in the South, 20% in the Midwest, and then 10% in the Northeast. But again, keep in mind that particularly with consumption, actual outcomes could vary significantly based on weather outcomes. Slide 11 looks at the Henry Hub spot price forecast for this winter. And what's important to keep in mind here is that the Henry Hub spot price forecast does not have a large immediate impact on what consumers pay for gas because of relatively slow lag between changes in wholesale price and changes in residential price. However, the level of Henry Hub price in the medium term is an important determinant of what residential gas prices are. So the left side of the forecast line, the blue line, shows the historical price. On the right side, the dark blue line is EIA's forecast, and that light blue line is the NYMEX Henry Hub futures price. And you can see for this winter, EIA's forecast is pretty close to the NYMEX price. But we construct uncertainty bands based on the prices of futures and options contracts. Those are the light gray lines that kind of go below and above the forecast, and those show the uncertainty in the market. And we put those on there to point out that the market itself, not EIA, is built in a pretty wide range of expected outcomes for prices over the next year. So slide 12 shows that Henry Hub spot price forecast. That's the bottom blue line, but then it shows the residential delivered price of natural gas during the winter. And that level of Henry Hub spot price, broadly kind of affects the residential delivered price. And then there's also significant seasonal variation here. And the most important thing to keep in mind here is it's very counterintuitive that the residential delivered price is lower in the winter and higher during the summer. But that's because there's a fairly substantial fixed component of gas bills. And when you have higher consumption, that average delivered price is spread over more consumption. So this is not a rate. It's an average realized price. And EIA is expecting that to be 2%, as we mentioned earlier, 2% higher for residential consumers this year. So inventories are an important metric for looking at the level of supply in the market, and are useful to track through the winter withdrawal season. So inventories typically build during the summer months and then are drawn down during the winter months. And inventories at the end of September were 4% below last year's level. But again, last year saw a record high of around 4 trillion cubic feet of gas in storage to start the winter. So this year we're expecting there to be 3.8 trillion cubic feet, which would be pretty close to in line with the 5-year average amount of gas in storage to start the winter. And again, EIA looks at how inventories might change in both a 10% warmer than forecast scenario and a 10% colder. And it's important to note here that even in a 10% colder than forecast scenario, we still expect inventories to stay within the 5-year range, which is that gray range you see here. So finally, for natural gas, the inventory draw this year is expected to average about 10 BCF a day, which is about 1 BCF per day higher than last year. And that graph on the left shows you the average winter draw over the past 5 winters and the forecast draw for this winter of 2017-18. And the graph on the right shows you kind of how this winter stacks up against last winter from supply and demand components. So, this winter, if you look, we have both higher natural gas use and higher natural gas supply. So natural gas supply is expected to be about 6 BCF a day higher. That's the kind of light blue column to the right over there. And then on the consumption side, on the use side, you see residential consumption is expected to be about 3 BCF a day higher, a BCF and a half more electric power consumption is expected, and then we're also expecting higher net exports this year. So all in, we're expecting about 7 BCF per day higher natural gas use this winter. So the difference there, that 1 BCF between higher expected natural gas use and higher expected supply, is the higher expected inventory draw that we showed on the previous page, and it shows up in the graph at left. So moving to heating oil, this is a similar graph to natural gas, but showing instead the wholesale prices, the Brent crude oil spot price, and the orange line is the residential heating oil price, and you can see those move pretty much in lockstep with each other, as changes in Brent crude oil prices are passed on pretty directly to residential heating oil prices. And we're forecasting crude oil prices to be about $2 per barrel higher this winter, which ends up being about 6 cents per gallon higher. We're also forecasting refining margins to be a bit higher this winter, and that's largely related to overall stronger demand for distillate fuel, of which heating oil is a part of, as is diesel fuel for on-highway consumption. And heading into winter, supplies were reduced a bit because of Hurricane Harvey. So because of higher crude oil prices and higher refining margins, we're expecting residential heating oil prices to be about 10% higher than last winter. Graph 18 shows this year's inventory situation compared with the previous winters or the previous years, and you can see that inventories were relatively similar to 2016 levels until really the middle of the summer, and that's when really high demand started to hit. And then in late August, Hurricane Harvey occurred, and that caused inventories in the Northeast United States, that key heating oil consuming market, to fall a little bit more. But again, even with those supply and demand factors at work, you're seeing inventories that are relatively close to the 5-year average, and that's helped out by refinery runs in the United States, which up until Harvey were at pretty high levels and are expected to return to pretty high levels in the coming weeks and months. Slide 19 is a similar look to what we saw for gas, but we're looking at East Coast. So keep in mind, these are a little bit different. This is East Coast, which is all of Pad 1. The other one was Northeast, which is Pad 1A and 1B, which runs down to about Maryland. And again, the important thing to note here is that even in a 10% colder scenario, your EIA is expecting inventories to maintain that, to stay inside of that 10-year range. So moving to propane, propane inventories are starting it's a fairly similar situation to heating oil. Propane inventories are starting the winter slightly lower than the 5-year average, but we have seen recent increases in inventories in the key consuming market of the Midwest. So moving to slide 22, again, about 5% of the homes, or 6 million homes, heat with propane, with the largest concentration of those in the Midwest. And there you're seeing, we're seeing prices a bit higher this winter, and consumption also a bit higher. So total expenditures in the Midwest are expected to be 21% higher. But again, that consumption, which is a function of actual realized weather outcomes, is the key variable to watch there. So the inventory situation in the United States, we're starting right about the middle of the 5-year range, slightly below the 5-year average, but pretty squarely in the middle of that 5-year average range. Below last year, but again, like I said, broken record. Last year and the year before were somewhat anomalously high inventory levels. The kind of key thing to look at here is the more regional breakdown of propane stocks. So we're looking at overall Pad 2 stock levels were relatively close to the 5-year average, but you're seeing a different picture in different places. So in Michigan and Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, inventories are higher than the 5-year range. So relatively high levels of supply in those areas. And again, you can see the recent increases in inventories, particularly in that lower right-hand graph, the Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin graph, where inventories increased quite a bit from June through September. Now, this is a fairly good situation because these are the main consuming regions, so you don't have to push the propane out of the Kansas hub to these regions. Now, Kansas, as I mentioned, there's a little bit of a different story there, where inventories are below the 5-year average. Kansas, of course, includes the Conway hub, which is a kind of a main trading hub for the Midwest propane, and a kind of point where propane moves either from the Midwest up into the consuming regions or down to Mount Belvieu in Texas. Electricity electricity is the final fuel we look at. Year-over-year changes tend to be more muted in electricity because one thing is average prices tend to change less year to year. You see pretty slow pass-through from underlying wholesale commodity prices to actual prices for electricity. So, most of the electricity use for space heating is concentrated in the south, and that's where we're expecting to see consumption up 8% last year. Again, similar to what we were saying for natural gas, consumption or temperatures are expected to be the biggest increase, or heating degree days, are expected to see the biggest increase year over year in the south of all the regions. But again, total expenditures is expected to be up between 4% and 11% across the regions for electricity. And this final graph it demonstrates the point I made earlier, that electricity residential prices change relatively slowly year to year. They've averaged an increase of 1.5% over the past 5 winters, which is roughly in line with inflation. You're seeing relatively slow growth in prices for electricity. And as John had mentioned, we have in our introduction, we have our winter heating fuels webpage and our shop program, and this is a really good resource for weekly updates of the heating fuel situation, which in some cases gets down to state level detail with data. So this is a particularly useful resource as the winter season progresses and you need updates on the situation. So that's the end of the formal slide. So I'm ready to take questions if people have any.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate that. It was an excellent, I think, outlook, and I'm relieved to see a lack of big concerns or problems. So that's always good news. So thank you for that. Shamika, do we have questions from our audience?
I do not have any questions or hand raised, but if anyone does, please either in the questions chat pane or raise your hand on the control panel, and I can unmute you.
I have a quick question, Tim, while folks are thinking about their questions. It relates to natural gas storage, and again, things look fine there. I know there have been certainly some improvements in the Northeast, and I'm on the edge of my knowledge here, but is the regional sort of breakdown of storage look similarly positive to the overall picture you gave? I might have missed that, but any comments there or suggestions you can make for additional information?
Yeah, so I talked about storage levels as of the September 29th, the latest weekly natural gas storage update. We're pretty close to in line with the five-year average, and pretty much across the eastern half of the U.S. they were very much in line with the 5-year average. The only region that really saw a deficit to the 5-year average was the West, which I think is still seeing a little bit of lower storage levels related to the Aliso Canyon leak we saw a couple years ago. So I think really the eastern half of the U.S. we're pretty close to in line across those eastern consuming regions.
Terrific, very helpful. Shamika, any additional questions?
Yes, I have a question from Jeff Pillen. Natural gas exports are projected to be 2 BCF this year. How does this net export level compare to the last few winters?
So yeah, we are expected to be, the United States is expected to be a net natural gas exporter this winter. And last winter, we were a net importer of gas on the order of around 6/10 of a BCF a day. So, we are seeing increased natural gas exports, both because of LNG, the construction of LNG facilities, and some increases in exports to Mexico. But yeah, it's also worth noting though that, as we showed on the slide, that's met with production that's about 6 BCF a day higher than last winter. So, there, that is coming from the higher exports are coming from increased production.
Great. Next question is from Doris Jansky. Are propane exports higher than last year?
Yeah. Yeah. They are. 1 second. Sorry. They are up from last winter. Well, actually, so net exports are actually 4% lower than last winter. However, and production is 7% higher than last winter. Sorry, to back up a second, EIA doesn't forecast for petroleum products. We don't forecast gross exports and gross imports. We only forecast a net number. So net exports are 4% lower this winter, but that doesn't necessarily mean that total exports are lower. It just means that there you could be seeing there could possibly be higher imports as well. And again, production is up 7% from last year.
Great. I have, let's see, Alice Lippert has her hand raised, but Alice, you do not have your audio pin enabled, so I can't unmute you. You want to chat, type your question in or enable your audio, then I can unmute you. I'll just give her a second.
Maybe we can follow up with that later, that question later, given that I think we're at time.
Yes, she said she would follow up with the EIA later.
Okay, terrific. Well, Tim, thank you very much again, you and your colleagues, John, Shirley, others at EIA for the forecast and for the time today and co-hosting the webinar. And thank you to all our presenters today. This information will, of course, be posted. The webinar was recorded. And for those of you on the line, if you have additional questions or follow-up, please contact Shamika Spencer at NASEO, and we'll make sure that we get the question routed to the right person. Any final closeout items, Shamika?
No, that's it. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you for joining, everybody, and this concludes the webinar.